In this lesson, we're going to look at the ProDiag option, which is a different way of managing alarms and diagnostics in the PLC using a built-in system that's a licensed system. You do need a license in order to use ProDiag. I think you can use 25 points for free, but after that, you're supposed to have a license. So it's very different to what we've been through in the last 3 lessons, and we're not going to jump into it too much because whilst it could fit the paradigm that we're sort of building in terms of a asset orientated approach, and it is geared around sort of working like that. It's not what we're actually doing in our final examples. We're using the method that we've just been through, but it is worth mentioning because ultimately you can have blocks raise their own alarms with their own text in a standard way, all working off the normal triggers and things like that we have in our, or normal conditions that we have in our other solution. You can do the same thing here, but it's all built in standard in the block, and you can edit the text and things like that in the PLC. So the fundamental differences are the actual text that is sent to the HMI is stored in the PLC, and you are free to edit those to sort of raise whatever you need to raise. And the other thing about it is that it uses a more centralized approach in terms of there's no arrays, there's no anything like that. It's all done on the interface of the block. So we'll jump in and have a quick look at how you would set one of those up. So the first thing that you need is a ProDiag block, which tells the PLC that you're using the centralized system. So you can do that if you select function block and you come down to ProDiag, and I'm just going to call this ProDiag and click OK. And this will create a special block that's not like any other block in the PLC, which allows you to configure your supervisions and manage your supervision instances. So the difference between a global supervision and a supervision instance is global supervisions allow us to access any data block, any tag here in the sort of project global layer where things are not standard. You know, this is the sort of like bespoke layer. We can set up anything that we want to in the global supervisions, whereas supervision instances are any instances of blocks that have interface elements that have built-in supervisions. So that might not make sense right now, but if I go to global supervisions and I add a new one for AV01, type data, and we're going to say alarms, conditions, fail to close. So if we get a fail to close condition on that particular data block, the AV01 data block, we can say trigger on false or true. So we want to trigger on true because when it goes true, we want to say that we failed to close. We're going to use the ProDiag FB, which is this one here, the one that we're in, to raise the supervision alarm. And then you have your type of supervision, and it's worth going and reading the help here. I'm not going to dive into what every single one of these are, but for this one, we're going to use operand. We're raising the category error, so you can raise different alarm categories here. Like the 3 that are already pre-configured are error, warning, and info. This one will be an error. We don't really need a delay time because our fail to close in our code already has the delay built into it, but you could actually raise the build the delay time into this layer. But I find that stuff quite difficult to fault find later when if you have a delay period of 5 minutes built into this layer, but you can see the conditions turned on and nothing's happening in the code, then it's quite difficult to follow and understand what's going on. But in here where this condition 1 is, you can specify an additional tag. So this would be like your enable alarms tag, and you can do the same for condition 2 and add an additional condition in, whereby all 3 of those would have to be true. We're not using those, so I think if you put nothing in the field, then it doesn't matter what these values are, but I turn them off anyway. And then the specific text field is what you want the alarm to say. So this one would be AV01 failed to close alarm. I think it was failed to close. Let's just check it wasn't failed to open. Yeah, failed to close. And that is my supervision for failed to close. And because it's global, it has nothing to do with the management block of the valve AV01. It's a completely separate thing. We're working directly off of the data, off of AV01's data block. And if we go and have a look at AV01's data block, so AV01, and we go into the data and have a look at this particular alarms conditions, you can see that it has this red supervision on it. And all this is doing here is just indicating that there is a global supervision assigned to this particular variable. Now, there's two ways that we can do the instance supervision or supervision instances. We can either create the supervision against the UDT valve alarms, whereby we say every time this UDT valve alarm is used, every time this structure is used, you must register supervisions for the instance of that UDT on failed to open, failed to close, and signal error. So we can actually add these at the UDT level. So if I was going to go to the definition of UDT valves, edit the type, I could say alarm, sorry, not alarm, I meant conditions, failed to open. So I'm using conditions because we wouldn't be using the alarm manager, if that makes sense. Like we wouldn't actually have this alarm manager and be generating this alarm field. So we'd have it off the condition to say raise the alarm, because we want to raise the alarm when the condition is true. And then you use your other conditions, condition 1 and condition 2 that we looked at earlier, to control when we actually want to raise that alarm if there was additional things. Or you could just not raise this Boolean value here if you wanted to inhibit the alarm. So again, we can come to supervision here, right click and say add new supervision. And this time you get a fly up menu at the bottom where you get the same fields that we had in the last sort of setup in the global area. So operand, this time the supervised parameter is filled in for you. We want it to be true, and we're not using these additional triggers. We don't want those. We want it to be a category 1, which is error. And then if you just expand this, for some reason they decided to put the specific text field in its own place. You do get a few more options that you don't get or aren't immediately obvious in the global area. And what this tag 1, tag 2, tag 3 is it gives you the opportunity to put a value in here and then reference that value in your specific text field. So for example, it doesn't work with this one because it's just true or false. But if this was a level error and you wanted to say the level's gone low and it went low because it was reading this value, you'd be able to put the level variable in here and then reference it in the specific text field using SD_4. And that's just a nice way of saying, you know, the level went below the low limit in brackets and whatever your low limit is set to by, and then your scaled value after. So you can see we breached it by, you know, a meter or whatever. And that's why this alarm is coming in. So in this one, again, you wouldn't be able to write something like this, AV01 failed to open, because we're at the UDT level. You don't know what valve this UDT is going to be using. So it's this sort of stuff that makes this a little bit more, you need to think about it a little bit more, because what you'd need to do is actually have a reference in your structure somewhere with the value in it that is, you know, saying the name of your valve. So you can actually put in, well, use the value that is in SD4. And then SD4 would need to contain AV01. So there's a little more thought that needs to go into using UDTs down at this level. But I'll just show you what this looks like now that we've now that we've put this supervision on here, if I was to just compile the project, so everything updates on the interface, which just take a few seconds. And I'm not quite, ignore that stuff. That's just because I was halfway through doing something when I started this lesson. But if I go and have a look at the ProDiag block now, and we look at supervision instances, you can now see that it's created one for every valve. So AV01, AV01 typed, AV01 typed alarms, and here condition failed to open. And if you look at the specific text, SD4 failed to open, you'll notice that you're not allowed to overwrite it, which is a shame, because if you could overwrite it, it would be nice and easy to come into this part, the specific text field, and update it with the required specific text value. So you'd be able to tag AV01 on the front and not have to worry about the whole, getting the name into the data that you're working with. However, it's not the end of the world. Like, there are easy ways of doing that, like through the input mapping layer, you could set the name and things like that. You'll notice that every single valve has had one of these set up for it, and you'll notice they all have a unique ID. And that's because they are all capable of raising their own unique message. It's just we've defined that message in the UDT. So hopefully that makes sense. There's one other place that we can do this as well, which also falls under the supervision instances, which is if I go to the actual manager. So if I go to my program blocks, and I go to asset management, valves, quarter turn valve, and I open this one here, we can do the same thing in the interface of our function blocks or our asset managers. So in our quarter turn valve manager, if we wanted to set the fail to open, fail to close, or signal error that comes from our asset data, you'll find that we're actually restricted and we're not able to do that. And that's because of how we're passing this information, or how the information is in this function block. So remember, we're coming through an in-out interface, which means we're doing a pointer and we're passing by reference. And in doing that, we're not able to actually set the condition. So if I come to the, where is it? The alarms, and I go to conditions, signal error, for example, and I try to set a supervision, I'm not able to. And I'm not able to because because we're passing by reference. So that should be handled in the UDT, not in the function that is using the UDT. However, you can set supervisions on data that the function block owns in its instance data itself. So this alarm active, for example, or this closed feedback. So healthy here, we'd be able to say add supervision. And on this one, we'd say when we're false. We're not using these ones here. And you can see, sorry, I didn't touch on this here, that alarm text C settings, this whole alarm text, you can set pre-configured text. So this would raise the PLC name, the ProDiag function block name, which would be quarter turn valve manager, whatever instance of that we're talking about, and then the specific text fields. And there's a little button here that lets you go off and edit what that sort of specific alarm text is, or what the what this part of the alarm text is. But if I go to a specific text field, again, I can write in here the not healthy alarm, and then SD_4. And if I do a compile, so all of the blocks are updated, what we should see this time is only some of the valves appear in our ProDiag. So what we can see now is that if I look at these supervision instances, we have a new one here, which is devices DB. And if I open that, we have AV01 healthy. And again, unable to change this specified text field. It's got to use the tag that's built into the text field. But the reason we're only seeing 1 is because if we actually go and have a look at the devices function block, which is using the instance devices underscore DB, what we'll find is there's only 1 in here called AVO1. But if I was to copy this and change it to AVO2, change it to AVO2, which I don't have a, I don't have a data block for just yet. Let me just quickly add that in. Valves. I don't have an AVO2, that's why, sorry. If I change that to AVO3 and AVO3, create that as a new instance, and then I do a compile, what we should see is in ProDiag now, we have this new AVO3, which is here, sat inside devices DB. And it's more complicated to set up, I feel, than the other approach that we've done. And you have the added complication of there being a license requirement. But once it's done, and you know that every single time you use this quarter turn valve or whatever the asset is that you're using, you are self-generating those alarms. And as long as you have the license to back up the amount that you're using, then you are effectively building your entire alarm profile as you just build your project, and you don't have to worry about anything like that. So it is definitely something that's worth exploring and worth looking at. But for the rest of this course, we won't be touching ProDiag. It gets a little bit more complicated in the HMI with how you pick this information up as well. Whereas the approach that we're using is a bit more generic with the alarm arrays, and it's a bit more scalable to other PLC vendors and things like that. So we'll stick with the arrays. But if you do have any more questions or anything that you want to know about ProDiag, then drop them in the comments or contact me on LinkedIn or drop me an email, and I'm happy to give a bit more information about that.